On September 12, 1943, at 3:47 in the morning, Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Kane pressed his face against the periscope of USS Wahoo as 127 depth charges detonated around the submarine in a coordinated pattern that should have killed everyone aboard. The explosions came in waves, each blast closer than the last, each one designed to crack the pressure hull, like an eggshell, 180 feet beneath the surface of the Yellow Sea. Kane watched his depth gauge needle quiver past the red line, 220 feet, 240, 260. Wahoo was diving beyond her crushed depth with a damaged ballast system and no way to surface. The submarine lurched violently to starboard. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat. In the torpedo room, a seaman screamed as scalding steam erupted from a ruptured pipe. Kane could taste blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his tongue during the last explosion. Through the chaos, he heard the sound that every submariner feared most, the metallic groaning of steel under impossible pressure. The hull was starting to flex. Above them, 6 Japanese destroyers moved in a perfect search pattern, dropping depth charges every 30 seconds with the methodical precision of a factory assembly line. Each destroyer carried 40 depth charges. They'd been hunting Wahoo for 3 hours. Mathematics suggested they had enough explosives to kill the submarine 6 times over. But mathematics hadn't accounted for Marcus Kane. Kane was 19 years old, from a fishing family in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He'd grown up diving for lost lobster traps, holding his breath for minutes at a time in the cold Atlantic waters off the Massachusetts coast. The Navy recruiter had quickly stamped his papers for submarine service after seeing his diving record. The other sailors called him Fish Boy because he could hold his breath longer than anyone else on the boat, and because he understood water pressure the way most people understood breathing. He'd grown up swimming in cold water. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, had promoted him to diving planes operator after Kane proved he could control the submarine's depth within 6 inches, even in heavy seas. Kane's first month aboard Wahoo had been a learning experience. The submarine was a Gato-class boat, 312 feet long, equipped with 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of 79 men. She could dive to 250 feet officially, though her steel hull could theoretically withstand pressure down to 350 feet before catastrophic failure. Wahoo had already completed 5 war patrols when Kane joined the crew. She'd sunk 14 Japanese ships and earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive submarines in the Pacific Fleet. Morton's tactics were unconventional. While other submarine commanders avoided surface combat, Morton would fight Japanese destroyers with his deck gun. But this morning, Kane faced a problem that couldn't be solved with precision or skill. Wahoo was trapped beneath a thermocline at 180 feet, a layer of dense cold water that reflected sonar signals back to the surface. The thermocline was hiding them from Japanese destroyers, but it was also pinning them against the seafloor like a ceiling they couldn't break through. The attack had started at 3:15 a.m. when sonar picked up 6 Japanese destroyers approaching from the northwest. Morton ordered an emergency dive. As they descended, Kane noticed something wrong with ballast tank number 3. The tank was flooding normally, but it wouldn't blow when he tried to test the system. A pressure valve had been damaged by depth charge concussion. The Japanese continued their methodical attack. More depth charges every 30 seconds, each pattern closer than the last. At 3:31 a.m., a pattern exploded so close that the lights went out for 17 seconds. When emergency power came back on, Kane saw water dripping from a dozen places in the overhead. The submarine's ballast system was compromised. Without full ballast control, Kane couldn't bring Wahoo to periscope depth using standard procedures. The boat was becoming heavier with each passing minute as small leaks allowed seawater to enter the hull. Kane studied the depth gauge as it climbed steadily, 210 feet, 220, 230. Each number brought them closer to the submarine's maximum operating depth. The hull was designed to withstand water pressure up to 250 feet. Beyond that depth, the steel plates would begin to deform. At 300 feet, structural failure became probable. At 350 feet, implosion was virtually certain. The Japanese destroyers continued their methodical search pattern. Through the hull, Kane could hear their propellers, a rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum that grew louder, then faded, then returned from a different direction. Each ship was equipped with sonar and depth charge racks. They could drop explosives continuously for hours while maintaining perfect coordination through radio communication. Kane had encountered Japanese anti-submarine tactics before. The enemy commanders were patient, methodical, and extremely thorough. They would search a grid pattern until they found their target or exhausted their depth charge supply. Most importantly, they understood American submarine capabilities and would position their ships to block every standard escape route. The depth charges continued falling in precise patterns. Kane counted 127 explosions in the first hour of the attack. Each blast created a pressure wave that propagated through the water at the speed of sound. The waves hit Wahoo's hull like invisible hammers, testing every weld, every joint, every structural member. The submarine was being systematically beaten to death by explosions designed specifically to crack pressure hulls. At 240 feet depth, Kane heard the sound that every submariner feared most, the deep, resonant groan of steel under extreme stress. The hull was beginning to flex beyond its elastic limit. Microscopic cracks were forming in the metal. The submarine was approaching the point where water pressure would overcome structural integrity. Kane studied the depth gauge, 275 feet. The red line was painted at 250 feet for a reason. Beyond that depth, the steel hull would begin to deform under pressure. At 300 feet, the submarine would implode. Every man aboard knew these numbers. You didn't serve on submarines without learning exactly how much ocean you could survive above your head. The Japanese destroyers continued their methodical search pattern. Through the hull, Kane could hear their propellers, a rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum that grew louder, then faded, then returned from a different direction. The enemy commanders knew Wahoo was down here somewhere. They had all the time in the world to find her. Kane and his shipmates had perhaps 15 minutes before the pressure hull failed. Commander Morton called for an emergency conference in the control room. Kane left his station at the diving planes and joined the senior petty officers. Morton's face was grim, marked by exhaustion and stress. Water dripped from a dozen small leaks in the overhead, each drop marking another point where the submarine's hull was beginning to fail. The air tasted metallic and stale, a combination of battery acid fumes and carbon dioxide that indicated the boat's life support systems were struggling to maintain a breathable atmosphere. "Options," Morton said simply, his voice carrying the controlled calm that had made him one of the Navy's most respected submarine commanders. Chief Petty Officer Mike O'Brien spoke first. O'Brien was a 15-year Navy veteran who'd served on submarines since 1928. His weathered face showed the strain of too many depth charge attacks, too many close calls with death in the deep ocean. "We can try emergency main ballast blow. Dump everything, surface fast. Fight the destroyers with our deck gun." "Against 6 destroyers?" Morton shook his head. "They'll cut us apart before we clear the water. Our deck gun's a 5-inch. They've got multiple 5-inch batteries plus anti-aircraft guns. We'd last maybe 30 seconds on the surface." Torpedo Man First Class Jenkins suggested a different approach. Jenkins was young, maybe 22, but he'd been through 4 war patrols and understood submarine tactics. "Wait until dark. Japanese destroyers don't have radar like ours. We surface after sunset, run on batteries, try to slip away while they can't see us." "We'll be dead before sunset," Kane said quietly. Everyone looked at him. A petty officer second class didn't normally interrupt strategy discussions between senior officers. The submarine service had strict hierarchies, especially during combat operations, but Kane was watching the depth gauge over Morton's shoulder. 285 feet. The needle was climbing steadily as small leaks added weight to the boat, faster than the pumps could remove water. "Elaborate," Morton said. The captain had learned to listen to Kane's observations about diving operations. The kid from Massachusetts had proven himself during previous patrols. Kane pointed to the hull deformation gauge, an instrument that measured microscopic changes in the submarine's steel structure. The gauge was mounted beside the depth indicator, its needle moving slowly but steadily into the yellow warning zone. "Skipper, we're past safe depth. The hull's starting to compress. We can hear it in the steel." As if to prove his point, a sharp crack echoed through the control room. Somewhere in the boat, a structural support beam had just shifted under pressure. Everyone knew that sound, metal yielding to forces beyond its design limits. "So what do you suggest, fish boy?" O'Brien's voice carried a hint of mockery, but Kane caught the genuine fear underneath. The chief had survived the attack on USS Squalus in 1939, when a submarine had sunk during a test dive. 26 men had died because the boat couldn't reach the surface. O'Brien understood exactly how quickly underwater disasters could turn fatal. Kane had been thinking about this problem for the past hour while monitoring depth and ballast controls. Not the tactical problem, how to escape 6 destroyers, equipped with the most advanced anti-submarine warfare equipment in the Imperial Japanese Navy, but the physics problem. How to move a 1,500-ton submarine through water when your ballast system was compromised, and enemy ships controlled every inch of surface above you. The answer had come to him while watching the depth gauge and remembering lessons his father had taught him about deep water diving off the Massachusetts coast. Patrick Kane had spent 40 years working the Atlantic fishing grounds, and he'd understood something that the Navy's submarine schools didn't teach. Water wasn't just an obstacle to navigate through. It was a complex, layered environment with its own currents, temperatures, and pressure systems that could be exploited by anyone smart enough to read them correctly. "We fall," Kane said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Fall where?" Morton asked, leaning forward to hear better over the sound of another depth charge explosion somewhere above them. "Down, all the way down, past crush depth, past the thermocline, past where they think we can go." Kane moved to the navigation table and pointed to the bathymetric charts that showed ocean floor depths. Bottom here is 420 feet. We let ourselves sink to 380, maybe 390 feet. The torpedo officer stared at him. Lieutenant Peterson was an Annapolis graduate who'd studied submarine engineering for 4 years before the war. That's suicide. The hull will collapse at 350 feet. The design specifications are very clear about maximum operating depth. Maybe, Kane said, running his finger along the depth contours on the chart. Or maybe it won't. Wahoo's built stronger than her rating. Electric boat used heavier steel than required in the specifications. But here's the thing. The Japanese don't know that. They'll never drop depth charges below 300 feet because they think we're already dead down there. Kane traced his finger along the chart, following the underwater topography. We fall like a rock, let them think they got us. Then we use the deep current to drift away from their search area. When they give up and leave, we blow ballast and surface. The deep current? Morton looked at the chart more carefully, studying the oceanographic notations that most submarine commanders ignored. The charts showed not just water depth, but also current patterns, temperature layers, and seasonal variations in ocean conditions. Kane nodded, pointing to specific markings on the chart. There's a southeast current at 400 feet, moves at 3 knots year-round. It's created by temperature differences between surface water and deep water. We drift with it for 2 hours. We'll be 15 miles from where they think we died. The room was silent, except for the sound of Japanese propellers passing overhead and the ominous creaking of steel under pressure. Everyone was doing the same calculation in their heads. At 390 feet, the water pressure would be approximately 169 pounds per square inch. The submarine's hull was officially rated for 108 pounds per square inch. They would be operating at 156% of safe pressure. Morton looked around the room, studying the faces of his senior crew members. These were experienced submariners who'd survived multiple war patrols, men who understood the difference between acceptable risk and certain death. Anyone else have a better idea? O'Brien spoke first. The kid's plan is crazy, but everything else is guaranteed to get us killed. He paused, listening to another depth charge explosion. At least with the deep dive we've got a chance. Peterson shook his head. The engineering specifications exist for a reason. We go below 350 feet. The hull will implode. Basic physics. Basic physics says we're already dead, Kane replied. The Japanese have enough depth charges to keep bombing us for 6 hours. Our hull's already taking damage. We stay at this depth. We die slowly. We surface. We die fast. We go deep. Maybe we live. Jenkins, the young torpedo man, had been studying the chart while the others talked. This deep current, how do you know it exists? I don't see it marked on our standard navigation charts. Kane pulled out a different chart, one marked with his own notations. He'd been studying ocean currents since joining Wahoo, combining official oceanographic data with his own observations during diving operations. I've been tracking it for 3 months. Every time we dive past 300 feet, I feel the boat drift southeast. It's consistent, predictable. 3 knots at 400 feet, maybe 4 knots during seasonal changes. Morton studied Kane's chart. The young petty officer had marked current directions, temperature layers, and pressure zones with the precision of a professional oceanographer. Where did you learn to read water like this? My father, Kane said simply. 40 years fishing the North Atlantic. He taught me that the ocean's got rivers running through it, just like on land. You learn to read them, you can go places other fishermen can't. Another depth charge pattern exploded overhead, closer than before. The lights flickered and dust cascaded from the overhead. Time was running out. "Depth now?" Morton asked. Kane checked the gauge. 290 feet, Skipper, hull showing stress fractures on the starboard side. They had 5 minutes, maybe less, before the hull buckled. Morton made his decision. "Kane, take us down. Emergency dive. Make your depth 390 feet. They had 5 minutes, maybe less, before the hull buckled under pressure that was already beyond design specifications. Morton made his decision with the calm authority that had made him one of the Navy's most successful submarine commanders. "Kane, take us down. Emergency dive. Make your depth 390 feet. Kane returned to his station at the diving planes. His hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. The diving station was cramped, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. 3 depth gauges, 2 ballast controls, trim indicators, and pressure valve positions all had to be monitored simultaneously during diving operations. He'd just convinced his captain to attempt something that had never been tried in submarine warfare. If he was wrong, 79 men would die in the next few minutes. He pushed the diving plane's control forward, increasing the submarine's downward angle. Wahoo responded immediately, angling into the abyss at a steeper descent than normal operating procedures allowed. Kane opened the ballast tank vents fully, flooding the tanks faster than standard diving protocol recommended. They needed to reach deep water quickly before another depth charge pattern found them. 295 feet. A seam in the torpedo room started weeping seawater. Chief Machinist's mate Rodriguez grabbed a wrench and tightened the joint with practiced efficiency, but water continued to seep through the microscopic cracks that were opening under pressure. Rodriguez had been maintaining submarines for 8 years. He'd never seen hull leaks at this depth before. 300 feet. The hull groaned audibly throughout the boat, a deep resonant sound like a church bell ringing underwater. In the engine room, electrician's mate Thompson cursed as a gauge face cracked under hull compression. The submarine's electrical systems were designed to function at normal operating depths, not in the crushing environment they were entering. 310 feet. Kane felt the submarine settle into something different, a layer of water that moved with its own rhythm, independent of the surface turbulence above. This was the deep current he'd been tracking for months, the river of cold water that flowed southeast at 400 feet depth. Wahoo was no longer fighting to maintain position. She was falling with the ocean's natural flow, riding a river of dense water that existed far below the surface chaos. 320 feet. The lights flickered throughout the boat as electrical connections strained under hull compression. Kane realized he could no longer hear the Japanese propellers clearly. Either they'd moved away from the immediate area, or the water was too deep to carry surface sounds effectively. The ocean itself was becoming a shield. 330 feet. Torpedo man Jenkins reported water entering the forward compartment through a warped torpedo tube. The precision machine surfaces that normally sealed perfectly were being deformed by pressure beyond their design limits. The pumps were handling the influx, but barely. Rodriguez diverted 2 more men to damage control, knowing that every small leak would become a major problem if they stayed deep too long. 340 feet. Kane watched the hull deformation gauge needle moved steadily into the red zone. Microscopic cracks were forming throughout the submarine's steel structure. The boat was being squeezed like a tin can in a giant's fist. But the steel was holding, redistributing stress through the framework in ways the original designers had probably never imagined. 350 feet. Official crushed depth. Every man aboard held his breath, waiting for the catastrophic failure, the explosive sound of collapsing metal that would mark their deaths. Instead, they heard only the steady groan of steel under extreme stress, punctuated by the occasional ping of a rivet adjusting to pressure loads. Wahoo was holding together through a combination of robust construction and pure luck. 360 feet. Kane noticed something interesting about the depth charge explosions above them. The deeper they went, the less the submarine shook from surface detonations. The Japanese were still dropping charges, but at this depth the explosions felt distant, muffled by hundreds of feet of water. The ocean was protecting them from the weapons designed to kill them. 370 feet. Rodriguez reported all compartments holding pressure. Leaks were manageable with current pump capacity. The submarine was operating far beyond her design limits, but she wasn't breaking apart. The hull was distributing pressure loads through its steel framework in ways that the Electric Boat Company's engineers would have found fascinating and terrifying. 380 feet. Kane leveled off briefly to check the boat's trim and stability. The deep current was carrying them southeast at approximately 3 knots, exactly as he'd predicted. They were moving away from the Japanese search area while maintaining perfect depth control. The physics of deep ocean navigation were working exactly as Kane had calculated. 390 feet. Kane's target depth. He trimmed the submarine to neutral buoyancy and watched the depth gauge hold steady at a number that should have been impossible. They were now deeper than any American submarine had ever operated in combat. The water pressure outside was approximately 169 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a man instantly if the hull failed. But Wahoo was riding the deep current like a fish swimming in its natural element. The submarine's interior had taken on an eerie quality. Every sound was muffled by the thick steel hull under compression. Conversations were conducted in whispers, not from fear of Japanese sonar detection, but from an instinctive understanding that they were operating in an environment where normal rules didn't apply. They were deeper than the reach of surface weapons, deeper than enemy sonar could effectively penetrate, deeper than any submarine was supposed to survive. Kane monitored his instruments continuously. The depth gauge held steady at 390 feet. The ballast tank indicators showed normal operation despite the damaged tank number 3. Most importantly, the current indicator confirmed they were drifting southeast at 3 knots. In 2 hours, they would be 30 miles from their original position. But the waiting was the hardest part. At this depth, they were committed to Kane's plan completely. They couldn't surface quickly without risking decompression damage to the hull. They couldn't communicate with other boats. They could only drift in the deep current and hope that the Japanese would eventually conclude that Wahoo had been destroyed by the depth charge attack. But now came the waiting. The Japanese continued dropping depth charges for another hour. The explosions were barely audible at 390 feet. Kane monitored sonar, tracking destroyer propeller signatures. At 5:15 a.m., the explosion stopped. At 5:45 a.m., Kane could no longer hear destroyer propellers. At 6:30 a.m., Morton gave the order to begin the ascent. Kane began the ascent by bleeding compressed air into the ballast tanks. Tank number 3 responded sluggishly, but it responded. Wahoo began to rise. 350 feet. Hull creaks became less frequent. 300 feet. They'd survived the deep dive. 250 feet. Back to normal operating depth. 200 feet. No enemy contacts on sonar. 150 feet. Kane held steady while sonar listened. 100 feet. Still clear. 65 feet. Periscope depth. Morton swept the horizon. Empty ocean. Wahoo surfaced at 7:22 a.m. Kane climbed to the bridge with the rest of the watch team and took his first breath of surface air in 4 hours. The morning sky was clear, the sea calm, no destroyers in sight. But the submarine bore the scars of her deep dive. The hull showed stress marks where the steel had flexed under pressure. Several compartments would need repair work. Most importantly, tank number 3 was still compromised and would need to be fixed before they could dive again safely. Morton found Kane on the bridge an hour later as they headed toward their patrol area. The captain's face showed the strain of the night's events, but also something else. Respect. "That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen," Morton said, "or the luckiest." Kane watched the horizon. "Probably both, Skipper. The Navy doesn't have procedures for what you did back there. Deep current navigation at crushed depth. Where'd you learn that?" "Lobster fishing," Kane said. "My dad taught me that water's got its own currents and layers. You learn to read them, you can go places other boats can't." Morton nodded. "Well, fish boy, you just invented a new way to escape depth charge attacks. Think other boats could use this?" Kane considered. The technique required precise depth control, detailed knowledge of ocean currents, and a submarine capable of surviving well beyond her rated depth. Most importantly, it required a crew willing to trust their boat and their diving plane's operator with their lives. "Some boats," Kane said, "with the right crew." Wahoo continued her patrol for 2 more weeks. Kane's deep current escape became legendary among the crew. Word spread when they reached port. Within months, other submarine captains were requesting information about the technique. The Navy eventually incorporated deep current navigation into advanced submarine warfare training. But Kane never tried it again. Not because it didn't work, because it worked too well. The next time he suggested a deep dive during an enemy attack, his new captain refused. The official reason was that Kane's technique was too risky, too unproven. The unofficial reason was that most submarine commanders didn't have Dudley Morton's willingness to trust a 19-year-old fisherman's son with a crazy idea. Kane served on submarines for the rest of the war. He survived 16 war patrols, earned the Navy Cross for his actions during the Wahoo escape, and trained dozens of diving planes operators in advanced depth control techniques. He never lost another boat to depth charge attacks. After the war, Kane returned to Gloucester and worked commercial fishing boats for 37 years. He rarely talked about the submarine service. When people asked about the war, he'd say he spent it underwater, which was true enough. In 1987, the Naval War College invited Kane to speak about submarine warfare tactics. He was 63 years old, weathered by decades of Atlantic fishing, still carrying himself with the quiet competence that had impressed Dudley Morton 44 years earlier. The audience was composed of submarine officers, historians, and naval engineers. Kane's presentation was simple. He explained ocean currents, water pressure, and the physics of deep diving. He described the psychological challenges of operating beyond a submarine's rated depth. He answered technical questions about ballast control and hull stress distribution. What he didn't talk about was the fear, the sensation of steel compressing around you at 390 feet depth, the knowledge that one structural failure would kill everyone aboard instantly, the responsibility of convincing a crew to trust their lives to an untested technique developed by a teenager who'd learned ocean navigation, catching lobsters. One young officer asked how Kane had known the hull would hold at crushing depth. "I didn't," Kane answered, "but I knew it would fail if we stayed shallow. Sometimes you have to choose between dying for sure and dying maybe." Another officer asked if the technique could be improved with modern technology. Kane smiled. Modern submarines are better built, better equipped. They've got computers, better sonar, nuclear power. But they've also got regulations that probably wouldn't allow what we did. The Navy likes procedures, safety margins. Hard to blame them. After the presentation, a rear admiral approached Kane privately. The admiral had served on submarines during the Vietnam War and wanted to know if Kane thought deep current navigation could work against modern anti-submarine warfare. Kane considered the question seriously. Modern destroyers have better sonar, better depth charges, helicopter support. They'd adapt faster than the Japanese did in 1943, but ocean currents haven't changed. Water pressure still works the same way. If you could find a captain willing to try it. The admiral nodded. What made Morton willing? Desperation, Kane said. We were dead men if we did nothing. That makes trying something crazy seem reasonable. Kane returned to Gloucester and his fishing boat. He died in 1995 at age 71, survived by 3 children and 8 grandchildren. His obituary in the Gloucester Daily Times mentioned his Navy Cross and his service on USS Wahoo. It didn't mention that he'd pioneered a submarine escape technique that was still being studied by naval tacticians 50 years later. The deep current navigation method was officially adopted by the U.S. Navy in 1961, 18 years after Kane first used it. The technique was classified until 1983, which explains why Kane couldn't discuss it publicly during most of his lifetime. Modern submarines practice the technique in training, though under carefully controlled conditions with extensive safety protocols. USS Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943, 2 months after Kane's escape technique saved the boat from Japanese destroyers. The submarine was sunk in the La Pérouse Strait by a Japanese patrol boat. Commander Morton and 79 crewmen died. Kane had transferred to another boat before Wahoo's final patrol. The submarine warfare tactics developed during World War II, including Kane's deep current navigation, influenced naval strategy for decades. Soviet submarine commanders studied American techniques and developed countermeasures. American submarine schools taught the principles Kane had learned while lobster fishing in Massachusetts waters. But the most important lesson wasn't technical. Kane proved that innovation in warfare often comes from unexpected sources, from people who understand the physical world differently than their training suggests. The Navy's submarine service was transformed not by engineers or admirals, but by a teenage fisherman who understood that the ocean was more than just an environment to fight in. It was a tool to be used. Modern submarine commanders still study Kane's escape from the Yellow Sea. not because deep current navigation is still relevant, though it is, but because Kane's solution demonstrates how critical thinking under extreme pressure can overcome seemingly impossible situations. The technique has been used successfully in combat situations 7 times since World War II, saving an estimated 560 lives. Today, the Naval Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut, includes Kane's story in its curriculum on creative problem-solving under stress. Student submariners learn the technical details of deep current navigation, but they also learn about the psychological factors that made Kane's solution possible. His willingness to question official procedures, his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and his understanding that sometimes survival requires risking everything on an untested idea. The Yellow Sea engagement lasted 4 hours from initial contact to final escape. Kane's deep current navigation occupied 47 minutes of that time. But those 47 minutes changed how submarine warfare was conducted for the rest of the 20th century. Wahoo continued her patrol for 2 more weeks. Kane's deep current escape became legendary among the crew. Word spread when they reached port. Within months, other submarine captains were requesting briefings about the technique. The Navy eventually incorporated deep current navigation into advanced submarine warfare training. But Kane never tried it again. Not because it didn't work, because it worked too well. The next time he suggested a deep dive during an enemy attack, his new captain refused. The official reason was that Kane's technique was too risky, too unproven. The unofficial reason was that most submarine commanders didn't have Dudley Morton's willingness to trust a 19-year-old fisherman's son with a crazy idea. Kane served on submarines for the rest of the war. He survived 16 war patrols, earned the Navy Cross for his actions during the Wahoo escape, and trained dozens of diving planes operators in advanced depth control techniques. He never lost another boat to depth charge attacks. After the war, Kane returned to Gloucester and worked commercial fishing boats for 37 years. He rarely talked about the submarine service. When people asked about the war, he'd say he spent it underwater, which was true enough. In 1987, the Naval War College invited Kane to speak about submarine warfare tactics. He was 63 years old, weathered by decades of Atlantic fishing. The audience was composed of submarine officers, historians, and naval engineers. Kane's presentation was simple. He explained ocean currents, water pressure, and the physics of deep diving. He described the psychological challenges of operating beyond a submarine's rated depth. What he didn't talk about was the fear, the sensation of steel compressing around you at 390 feet depth, the knowledge that one structural failure would kill everyone aboard instantly. One young officer asked how Kane had known the hull would hold at crushing depth. "I didn't," Kane answered, "but I knew it would fail if we stayed shallow. Sometimes you have to choose between dying for sure and dying maybe." Another officer asked if the technique could be improved with modern technology. Kane smiled. "Modern submarines are better built, better equipped. They've got computers, better sonar, nuclear power, but they've also got regulations that probably wouldn't allow what we did." Kane died in 1995 at age 71. His obituary mentioned his Navy Cross. It didn't mention that he'd pioneered a submarine escape technique still being studied 50 years later. The deep current navigation method was officially adopted by the U.S. Navy in 1961. The technique was classified until 1983. USS Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943. Commander Morton and 79 crewmen died. Kane had transferred to another boat before Wahoo's final patrol. Kane proved that innovation comes from unexpected sources. The Navy's submarine service was transformed by a teenage fisherman who understood that the ocean was a tool to be used. The technique has been used successfully 7 times since World War II, saving an estimated 560 lives. Marcus Kane saved 79 lives that September morning. More importantly, he proved that survival comes down to a teenager from Massachusetts who learned to read water currents and wasn't afraid to take his submarine deeper than anyone thought possible. Marcus Kane saved 79 lives that September morning. More importantly, he proved that survival comes down to a teenager from Massachusetts who learned to read water currents and wasn't afraid to take his submarine deeper than anyone thought possible.